we saw that according to the Bhagavad Gita, in the beginning, he discusses the human personality, an individual's personality, as comprised of two parts, the immutable self and the mutable self. We also saw that later on, these two terms are borrowed from the Vedanta. Later on, the Gita switches over and borrows the terms for the same thing, more or less, now from the Sankhya philosophy. And in the Sankhya philosophy, the two terms are Purush and Prakriti. We also saw the essence in very briefly that Purusha is pure consciousness, generally passive, and Prakriti is pure energy, movement, action, but it is largely blind. And also, though the Purusha is the passive element, one role, one function it performs, and that is to act as the sanction giver. It is only after the Purusha grants such sanction that the play of the dance of Prakriti begins. It's like, you can say, the arrival of the chief guest who just sits and watches, but the dance performance, etc., starts only after the arrival of the chief guest. So this is more or less what we saw yesterday about the nature of the Purush and Prakriti. We also saw that gradually the Purusha's relationship with Prakriti undergoes change. In the beginning, it is almost, so to say, under the thumb of Prakriti. The next stage is, it starts watching the movements of Prakriti. It is able to partially detach itself and observe the play of Prakriti. So this second stage is the Sakshi, the witness. He doesn't intervene, but he just passively observes. We also saw that this passive observation, it may sound as though it is passive, but actually it has great power locked up in it. And it is even this passive observation, this awareness, gradually imparts control to the Purusha over the movements of Prakriti. The next stage is of Anumanta, the sanction giver. Anumati is sanction. Anumanta is one who gives sanction. So the next stage, from a passive witness, from Sakshi, he becomes Anumanta, and he generally gives sanction, but now the giving of sanction cannot be taken for granted. It is not automatic. He may give it. Most of the time he gives it, but then he can also withhold sanction. And the next stage is of Ishvara, where he is the Lord of Prakriti, and Prakriti obeys his commands. It is no more that Prakriti leads him. It is now he controls Prakriti. We also saw how Prakriti functions. Prakriti is comprised of several elements, and there are the 5 basic elements, then there are the 5 senses, and then there are the 5 means of acting, and then there is the manas, the buddhi, and the ahankara. And also, Prakriti functions on the basis of the 3 gunas of sattva, rajas, and tamas. These 3 gunas are almost like when you look through a kaleidoscope, you know that thing for children, even a little tilt changes the pattern. So you see a different design through that kaleidoscope every time. So here, because it is the nature of these gunas to always be in motion, and sometimes some guna predominates, sometimes some other guna predominates, and it is these gunas that create our different moods, and it is these moods that to a great extent govern or control or in fact I would say determine our behavior. So to a great extent we are under the control of Prakriti. And lastly, we saw the nature of the 6th sense, manas. The manas has this tendency always to, through the holes of Prakriti, through the windows made by Prakriti for the senses, through those apertures, through those holes, it always rushes outward. When it rushes outward, it starts sort of, roving over the objects around us. And as it roves, some object attracts it. As it gets attracted, it dwells on that object. As it dwells longer, it creates an asakti, a desire, attachment for that object. Attachment creates desire, and that desire is the desire to possess it. And we saw how when this desire is not fulfilled, it leads to anger, it leads to loss of memory, it leads to loss of intelligence, to discrimination. And the last of that series was buddhi nasha pranashyati. And when the buddhi is lost, the intelligence is lost, the human being is back to the stage of an animal. And therefore, we also saw that it is this tendency of the mind which is the single greatest obstacle for the Purusha to acquire control over Prakriti.